Hello everyone, I'm Miriam Mujgan and I'm so happy that you all made it to Bled. I welcome you to the Bled Strategic Forum on behalf of my Ministry of Foreign Affairs who has organized this event and on behalf of our partner in this project, Center for European Perspective. I do thank you for one more thing because you apparently brought sun to Bled. Those of you who stayed for the night, you saw how it was raining in the morning and pouring. So we do thank you for that. Though we like rain these days, we had hot, dry, hot summer, and rain was good news. And beside Mayor of Bled told me that the rain in Bled stays mainly outdoors, so we should be fine. So Bled is a source of inspiration and in many ways a symbolic center of Slovenia. Already in the first half of previous century, in the 19th century, to be correct, our national poet France Prešeren, whose statue you may have seen in Ljubljana, compared the lake, the island and the countryside to the image of paradise in his work Baptism on Savica. And 1 century later, one greatest architect, Plečnik, designed the pillar of the Blessed Virgin Mary that stands in front of the parish church here in Bled. On the rear of Mary's mantle, he carved a shield which shows for the first time the image of Triglav and overlooking the lake with a six-pointed star above it. And today this symbol is emblazoned in the coat of arms of the Republic of Slovenia. I'm mentioning this for a reason. Both the poet Prešeren and architect Plečnik found an inspiration in this special place to create works that help the Slovenian people survive the local challenges in the last 2 centuries. And surely being here should also help us find some answers and creative energy to address the regional and global challenges that lie ahead. The main theme of the Bled Strategic Forum is Europe in the Reshaped Global Order. I read recently that the Chinese word for crisis is composed of 2 characters. First suggests the concept of imminent danger, and second, opportunity. At Bled, we will discuss both dangers and opportunities of the crisis, and some great ideas were already heard this morning at the Business Bled Strategic Forum that took place in Bled Business School of Management, IEDC. And I do thank Dr. Danica Purk and Barbara Wilfan for their wonderful cooperation. Yesterday we had Young Bled Strategic Forum. We've heard some impressive young people from the Western Balkans, Mediterranean, Central Europe, to talk about the challenges in their region and talk about the challenges they are facing. And we've heard that the so-called Generation Y, the digital natives, some call them, they are in a kick-off position and ready to start to work. But we see that latest figures reveal that there's a huge 25% increase in youth unemployment across Europe in the course of the past 2 years. Secretary General Gurria talked about in his speech the business forum of that, and I'm sure he will repeat some of those figures again on the main forum. And the question is, can we afford to lose talent of this generation? These young people need vision, and I'm sure they will get some vision from this remarkable audience and panelists today. We've also heard about changes that new technologies are bringing to international relations. It's a completely new world for us, digital immigrants who were not born into the world with the internet. I know many of you in diplomacy are still puzzled about the new concept of digital diplomacy, personal diplomacy, still puzzled. Well, ministers are talking to each other via mobile telephones and making lives of ambassadors miserable by doing that. and ministers, those who laughed were your ambassadors. So these changes are brought into our world also by companies that are among our major sponsors of the Bled Strategic Forum, which tries to promote innovative ideas. The sponsor general of the forum is Slovenian company Keter Air, a Maribor-based telecommunication enterprise, owner, producer of new wireless technology Air. And we are happy that you are supporting this forum. We are also happy that BMW Group is our loyal automotive partner for the 4th year in a row. I would like to thank their BMW Group Slovenia team. Also thank other sponsors, Bisola, IBM, Rico, and special thanks to Delo Publishing House. And I would also like to thank my wonderful, wonderful team, especially Ernea Forschner, Alenka Žigon, and Polona Mal for their wonderful work, and my colleagues from the Center of European Perspective, Andrej Varčon, Nina Čepon, and the rest. And thank you also, Ministry of Defense, for helping us out with the transportation, Ministry of Interior, Government Protocol, and Government Office of Communication. I think we prepared a great program for you today. On the to-do list for the following 2 days, you should have these items: enjoy the panels, take part in discussions, enjoy the networking reception with the President of Slovenia as a keynote speaker, taste the soft power of this place, the so-called cream cakes, meet interesting people, take a swim in the lake, it's still warm, walk around the lake, and do come back next year. And now I sound like I'm being a mayor of Bled already, but I'm not. But he is here, and he will welcome you on behalf of this city. I would like to welcome Mr. Janez Pfeiffer.
Thank you, Miriam. It's the 6th time I'm allowed to speak to such distinguished guests as you are, to all your excellencies and ladies and gentlemen who found the time to come here and to come closer to each other on a place I hope you all agree it really is beautiful. I don't see it beautiful every day, don't believe me. Running a mayor with all this structure, running a place like this is not always an easy task, but it is a great honor to see that people come here and that people, we hope, might come closer to each other. And I hope you'll be frank to each other, not too diplomatic, even though you're diplomats, because this is a chance where you're half private. And whatever you can do to make the life of your people better, I will be very happy if this started in Bled. So enjoy it, enjoy your company, make new friends, be open and be frank, and welcome back next year.
Thank you, Mr. Pfeiffer. And now I would like to ask Minister of Foreign Affairs, Karel Erjavec, who is your host, to give us the opening address.
Spoštovani gostje, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to welcome you at the Bled Strategic Forum 2012. We came to Bled for the 7th time to discuss the pressing issues of today's world. This forum will be a great opportunity to exchange our views with the aim to find new answers to challenges we face. I'm pleased to know that so many of you keep coming back to take part in these debates. Once again, several key global actors accepted our invitation to join us this year. The main topic of this year's Bled Strategic Forum is the Europe and the Reshaped global order. We have been facing fundamental changes of international community many times in the past. I'm certain that future generations will also face them. Still, Europe is currently facing a difficult phase. may be the most difficult since the beginnings of the European integration process. Geopolitical changes combined with the global economic and financial crisis are posing many questions, but also bringing new opportunities to Europe and its partners. Ending the economic, financial and debt crisis is an absolute priority. Crisis management alone is not enough. We should find effective key answers as soon as possible. Time for undertaking reform is short. The need to establish trust in our common European project is urgent. We need trust among ourselves. No real solutions are possible without bringing back the trust of the people in EU institutions. To move ahead, we need to advance in growth, achieving fiscal consolidation, and to not overlook solidarity. But how? Should we follow the American strategy to increase consumption in order to fight the crisis? Or should we stick the more conservative European strategy of imposing deep cuts and public spending? Is there a balance between the two? Yesterday, at the Young BSF, we have heard from some impressive young leaders how they see this situation and how they are more than ready to start working. We cannot lose the talent of this generation. I'm sure they can offer us some credible and fresh answers. New political and economic global players are becoming more influential. We face the historic task of enabling European Union to become a global player. But somehow both Europe and its countries are still trying to find their place in the new international community. Should we stay with our traditional partners at any cost, or should we loosen some of the old ties in order to build new partnerships? Should economic interest really dominate our international relations? Is there still time and place for human rights, arms control, and sustainable development? What should Europe do to be heard, and what should its smaller members, including Slovenia, do? I'm afraid that we are missing some vital opportunities. While Europe is struggling to keep its economies alive, other players follow their specific interest in other regions of the world, especially in Arab countries and Central Asia. European role in global affairs, both political and economic, has to be strong and visible. In the eyes of its global partners, the EU lacks credibility and willingness to act. It is also too often seen as a group of countries that, in times of crisis, always put national interests before those of the Union. At the same time, it is essential to understand the special nature of the EU. Our partners should accept it as we have to adapt to the changes at the global stage. If Europe wants to play a key political role globally, it has to do its own homework in its neighborhood. We all know that the Western Balkans is still a grey area on Europe's map. The promised European integration seems not to be an effective motivation anymore. Most of the countries of the region are willing to undertake all the necessary reforms and to play by the European rules. In the time of economic crisis, this is very hard for respective governments. The EU should not ignore that fact and make additional steps to support them in the accession process. And honestly, maybe we are not able to offer them much more than security and democratic values at this point. But is that not the basis of every successful democracy? Hopefully, we will get some answers at the panel discussion tomorrow. I'm convinced that we will hear some great debates in the following 2 days. What we need is fresh thinking and creative ideas to move ahead. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank our sponsors and partners who have been loyal supporters of the Bled Strategic Forum for the last several years. I would especially like to thank our general sponsor, the Slovenia innovative company Cater Air, owner and producer of a new wireless technology Air. I would also like to thank the BMW Group, who is our automotive partner. Dear friends, let's have a good time discussing. I wish you to enjoy the Bled. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. We are sticking to the timetable. This is good news, because it's always a challenge for our organizer, because the speeches tend to be usually too long. So we are fine now. I would like to welcome on the floor the distinguished audience of the main panel. We've managed to really attract some impressive leaders again this year, and I would like to welcome on the floor Secretary General Gurria, Sir Chakrabarti from European Bank for Development, and European Commissioner Potočnik, and also Mr. Deputy Prime Minister Lajčák, and also and it's a great honor that Nick Gowing kindly offered to moderate this panel. Thank you.
We've avoided Well, good afternoon, everybody. We've avoided breaking the glass already, which is a good sign. I'm bringing this onto the platform because in our discussion, remember what we've just heard, be frank, come up with new ideas. In the next hour and a half, my job is to make sure that we can make this something of a cauldron of new ideas if possible, given the enormity of the issues that we face across Europe and much more broadly in the global order. I don't have to tell you how serious things are at the moment. And if you looked at the front of the Wall Street Journal on Friday, the Euro crisis faces judgment days. The Financial Times yesterday, after Bernanke in Jackson Hole. The difficulties ahead, the uncertainties ahead, even more so than what we've all been facing in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly with the uncertainty at the moment of the German Constitutional Court and so many other variables, including the US election. So there is a new order, a new global order, which is not just shaped, it is still shaping itself. And we are part of that process. And the reason I've brought a laptop up here is because in this hour and a half, we want you to be part of this discussion. The panel are not going to be preaching to you. It's not going to be about a couple of questions at the end. For those of you who simply cannot leave your iPhone, your iPad, and I should mention, of course, Samsung as well, alone, and maybe you're moving into a post-lunch Sunday afternoon snooze mode, I'd like you to think not of doing your emails at the office, but actually contributing something. And the way we're going to do that, and the address is going to go up here, is that you can start commenting right from the beginning to what you hear up here on the platform, and I will be injecting it in. If you don't send me any messages, I'll know that you're quite happy for them to talk. Could we just put the address up? There it is. Send comments and questions to bledquestions@gmail.com. And if you put your name on the email, then we'll know that we can come to you with a microphone to contribute as well, to add to what you've already said. My experience is this can be very effective because rather than being prescriptive from the platform, you, particularly the next generation who are here as well, the global change makers and others, you may have a rather different view and want to change the framing of how the discussion will go up here on the platform. Now, I was joking with Angel Gurria, the Secretary General of the OECD, that I chaired him in Berlin a few months ago, and then he was in the audience, and I kept getting all these bits of paper being sent to me, and I realized they were all in the same handwriting. And I realized it was Angel Gurria sending all the questions in from the audience. So, Angel, you cannot send your own questions in this afternoon on your iPad or your email. So that's where I'd like to go over the next hour and a half. And remember, we want you to be frank. It's not just about the platform talking to you. We'd like to hear your comments. And particularly if you've got a brand new idea, a great big idea that you'd like to put into the mix. And Natasha Britsky will be trying to harvest this and help me because we're in touch with each other. And of course, you can stand up as well. But I want you to feel that you're in this right from the get-go. So, who do we have on the platform? Well, Miriam has introduced them already, but let me underline, and I'll introduce them as we go along, I think, now. Angel Gurria, Suma Chakrabarti, Janusz Potočnik, and Miroslav Lacek. I've told them that they're not going to make long speeches, or if they do, I'll still be asking questions afterwards. But what I want to do is help frame the way they are looking at this critical issue at the moment. And I notice, Angel Gurria, let me come to you first, that in your documentation at the moment, you're saying that the paradigm is lost. And therefore, I'd like you to build forward on that theme in your opening thoughts.
Thank you very much. We are facing challenges that are new. We today have a situation of very low growth, very high unemployment, particularly of the youth, growing inequalities, and of course, you have to understand, if you put all those things in a jigger, low growth and high unemployment of the youth, and throw in a few drops of high in growing inequality, and you serve that, as they say in James Bond, stirred not shaken or something like that, or shaken not stirred. You serve that and it blows up in your face. It becomes Tahrir Square, it becomes Los Indignados, it becomes Occupy all over the place. It becomes the Arab Spring, etc. It also has another dimension besides the youth and the social dimension. And it has the dimension of Europe now not being able to move out of its morass, with the Greek situation coming back for the third time in the scenario, and then, of course, with the likes of Spain and Italy, even though they've done their homeworks and they've done their policies, etc., being subjected to enormous market pressures. Now, when you run out of monetary policy room, and when you run out, because interest rates are at zero, pretty close to that, when you run out of fiscal policy room, what do you do? Well, what we say at the OECD is go structural, go social, go green. Go structural because, education, innovation, competition, liberalization of the labor markets, of the product markets, health, infrastructure, deregulation, decentralization, etc., the tax structure are the ones that are going to keep us going forward. Go social because there are 15 million more unemployed than there were before, and that is putting pressure on the budgets, besides it's creating political and social tension. And go green because we are on a collision course with nature. We have not done very much except talk a lot about it. And we're going to go way beyond the 450 particles per million in 2020, and it's going to take longer and more expensive to get down to the path where we will only have warming of 2 degrees in the world, as we have agreed was the appropriate way. So all these forces are shaping what today is the new reality and the new challenges for Europe. And let me just finish by saying Slovenia is no exception, and perhaps I would say Remember the Avis rule. The Avis rule is we are number 2, so we try harder. Take away the United States, Germany, maybe UK, Japan, period. Everybody else is in the Avis group. Everybody else is number 2. Certainly a small open economy in Central Europe, like Slovenia, has to try harder. So the question of dealing with the pensions, the question of dealing with the labor markets, the question of dealing with the banking situation, the question of dealing with your state-owned enterprises, the question of dealing with the competitiveness, even some governance issues, like the question of your referendum rules and laws, have to be taken a hard look at. And then, once you do that, we can all go out and say, you've done it, we'll celebrate. If you don't, the problem is the market is closing in on you. And the problem is, if you are forced, and I stress the word forced, to go and get support from the European Union and the IMF, you will still have to do all those same reforms, except the timing, the rhythm, the conditions will be dictated by somebody else rather than yourself. So, then why not? And that includes the golden rule. Okay? Germany has done it. Spain has done it. Italy has done it. The UK has an Office of Budgetary Responsibility. The Swedes have a fiscal council. Why are you still debating it here? If you're willing to do a law, why not put in the Constitution and get a bigger bang for your buck and get a bigger impact in the markets and let the world say Slovenia is serious about going with sound public finances. So, stay the course. We're not there yet. And do the reforms. Thank you.
One of the areas we want to get into is leadership, and particularly how it's been so incremental, adjusting to everything as it develops rather than thinking the big thought and taking the political risk. Can I just angle, before we move on, just pick up on that critical phrase which is there in your documentation: the paradigm has been lost.
The question is, we are facing a new world. We were used to solving things in a certain way. And when the paradigm is lost, then you need leaders to come out and spell out what the new paradigms are. What we have now is a conflict, because we have a new situation, we're faced with new challenges, and at the same time we're trying to defend the old order and talking about moral hazards and talking about, whether the institutions should serve the people or the people should serve the institutions. We created these institutions, for heaven's sake, in order to serve the people. And now we're hesitating to call them in to serve the people precisely when the paradigm is shifting and when the challenges are greater. We do need the leaders of Europe, but you mentioned, Nick, it's also in the United States. It's also in Japan. In Japan, we've got the 7th Prime Minister in 6 years. This is the question of the steady, clear leadership, clear signals that will spell out not only the new paradigm, but the ways to address it are absolutely indispensable.
Please, if you're champing at the bit and want to come in and you've got something in your hands which you can tap on, remember up there the email address, bledquestions@gmail.com. Let's move on to the European Bank and Suma Chakrabarti. Suma, you've been only in the job for 2 months, but it's been already a very turbulent time, even through the quieter times of August. And I think it's worth reminding everybody that the European Bank, the EBRD, you're owned by 63 countries, and your aim is to promote the market economy, processes supporting entrepreneurs at every stage. And I'm particularly struck by your current documentation, which talks about how things are getting worse, and you talk about how a timely implementation of the latest EU summit decisions may limit the risks. Can I ask for your thoughts at the moment, as you've just flown in from Belgrade, where you've given them 800 million euros of support because their unemployment rate is going up and because of the other fundamentals changing quite seriously badly?
Thanks very much, Nick. Angela is always a very hard act to follow, but I'll have a go. I'm quite seriously worried. First of all, because there is a looming crisis in Eastern Europe, in my view, and that, our forecasts that you mentioned, Nick, are showing that. We expect quite a slowdown this year and next year, perhaps better times from 2014 onwards. Unemployment's rising, youth unemployment's rising. That's really, really worrying, I think. So I'm very worried about just the facts as we see them. But I'm also worried, as someone who's been involved in this region for over 20 years now, about what this is doing for the self-confidence of the region, and of not just the leaders, but also of the population, in the transition that's been going on for 20 years in the right direction after the fall of communism. So I think there's some big issues here that's underlying it. What's really irritating me is the fact that no one really talks about it. We talk a lot about Spain, Italy and Greece, and so we should, because they're really important. But we're not talking enough about what's happening in this region and why it's so important to try and rescue the situation. So, growth is slowing down, turning negative in some countries. The Eurozone crisis is spreading east. Look at the numbers for Russia, too. It's not insulated because it has oil. It's also slowing down. Capital flows into the region have turned negative in the second half of 2011. And Eurozone bank deleveraging is going on. So all of that's happening. Credit's been contracting. There are some exceptions. Poland, Slovakia, Bulgaria to some extent. But overall, it's not a very pretty picture. And it's not talked about. Southeastern Europe is probably the most vulnerable of all those regions. So what does this lead me to say? Well, I think we're in for a really, really difficult time in Central and Southeastern Europe because of the exposure to the Eurozone. And there is also crisis fatigue going on as well. I notice increasingly growth in what I would call political populism and reform reversals, in the sense of reforms being slowed down, timetables being delayed and so on. But what's worrying me also is a rise in what I call economic nationalism. Increasingly, I'm seeing leaders arguing that there are strategic industries that need protecting, that really we can't reform them for a bit longer. And actually the definition of what is a strategic industry seems to be widening as well, from the understanding many of us had 10, 20 years ago. I'm really worried that actually this crisis, we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So while I back, actually, as Angel would, I'm sure, some of the regulation to be much tougher than it ever used to be on the banks, I also want to push ahead with private sector development. My view is we need a plan, and we need a plan for this region as part of the new order. It has to be a plan for growth. That's the only way we're going to tackle this, and it requires coordinated international action, but also strong domestic policy action. On the international side, institutions like mine really do need to raise the arguments much more strongly than perhaps we're able to at the moment. I think not just in the Vienna Initiative type way, but also we need to push the other IFIs, working with Angel in the OECD, to really make the case for actually a much more coordinated action. In terms of our own lending, we need to look at ourselves and ask, have we got the right priorities given the current crisis? Are we focusing enough on, frankly, employment creation industries, and particularly on the banking sector, which I'm really worried about, because banking has a sort of tentacle effect on other industries if you don't get it right. And I think there's a big question for us there as well. But to finish with, I think there's a real issue about leadership in the governments of emerging Europe too. Of course it's important to continue the good macroeconomic policy, the fiscal side action that we're seeing now in Slovenia and some other cases too. And I think that's a really good thing. But we've got to accelerate the structural reforms. I see Angel has come, as usual, armed with his many books here, and they're all absolutely spot on. They're all about structural reform that needs to take place in Eastern Europe. I think the importance of the private sector needs to be renewed. That does mean an attitude towards privatisation that needs to change, in my view, and we need to get back onto that agenda. Banking sector reform particularly crucial as part of that. We need to own up to the fact that judiciary systems are not being reformed fast enough in this region, and that is not giving confidence to private investors. We need to talk about pension reform, labour market reform. All of these are very, very important. We need to create a more flexible economy that reduces unit labour costs, because that's been part of the problem too. All of these structural actions and the other actions will over time attract more private investment, both international and domestic private investment. Now, what's the task to finish with for political leadership? Well, it's huge, because essentially we're asking political leaders to build social and political consensus for fiscal action and structural reforms that may not be in their interest of their own parties in the short term, or their sections, their sectional interests. They've got to take on vested interests as part of this. That is the leadership challenge here that we all face. It's not because leaders don't want to do this. I've talked to many leaders in Serbia yesterday and here, and people do want to do this. Leadership here does want to do this. But it's a very important thing to do, to try and emphasize national interest over party or sectional interest, and to build that social and political consensus. We also need to show that no country is an island. Slovenia is not doing this alone. The structural reforms that you're planning here are being planned elsewhere too. So a lot more engagement across the region with each other about how to take this up is really, really important, and building cross-border investments too. So tough decisions are required ahead, but they're inescapable in my view for exactly the reason Angel said. I'd rather these decisions were taken without the IMF and World Bank telling countries to do it, actually, because we're taking these actions ourselves. And task for institutions like mine is to provide the lending, the policy support to help countries like Slovenia and all the other countries in this region take those actions and get back to growth.
I think we need to pick up the leadership issue because it is a major challenge, and also the tyranny of the political cycle, which is out of sync with the economic realities of what is being faced. You all know them very well, but let's try and build on that shortly in this discussion. But, Soma, can I come back to you and ask you one other thing? You're talking about Eastern Europe. You mentioned briefly Russia, and that's certainly in your regional economic prospects. But I need to also ask you about North Africa and the Middle East, in which the European Bank is now actively engaged. And, of course, it is the backyard of Europe, but it is part of the new global order, even with all the uncertainties of what's happening in Syria, North Africa and elsewhere. Could you give us just a couple of minutes of how you see that impacting on European judgments with all these critical questions you're all putting on the agenda?
Well, I can't emphasise how important development and reconstruction is in North Africa. I think for political reasons it's very obviously important in terms of changing the dynamics of those countries and the way they think about the future and giving them hope, giving their people hope. But it's also important, frankly, in terms of Europe's own interests, that those countries develop faster. What I've been emphasising since I became president, in fact in the campaign as well, that this isn't a zero-sum game, some sort of competition for resources between Eastern Europe and North Africa. I fundamentally think the two regions actually can help each other. In fact, as I've been going around this region, I've been saying to leaders here that you had long-standing commercial, economic ties and political ties with that region. Those need to be resuscitated. There are actually investment opportunities for Slovenian companies, for Serbian companies and others to actually engage back with that region. And the EBRD, part of our task, is to help that happen. The other bit of it, I think, is actually political leaders in these countries who have been through transition are far better equipped to talk to Arab leaders about transition than, frankly, leaders from the UK, France and others, for whom this happened a long time ago. This is more real, more vital, more relevant.
You're still doing a lot of scoping work, I know, in North Africa. You're still not quite sure in your own minds where this is moving and the kind of absolute policy certainties that you need. How would you describe it?
Well, I think we're in pretty good shape, actually. We've got the country assessments done for 3 of the countries. The shareholders have ratified our involvement in those 3. So the first projects for Tunisia, Jordan and Morocco will be at the board in 2 weeks' time. Egypt, I think, towards the end of October. But yes, we need to know those economies far better. We need to work with the OECD to get to know these places far better. We're starting up. But I'm pretty confident, actually, we can get going quite quickly. Very important that we all focus on the small and medium-scale industries in particular. Many of those industries were excluded during the previous regimes, actually, and I think part of building both the political hope and the economic hope for that region is getting them off the ground, those small and medium-scale enterprises, many of which are run by women, actually, and also this is one way of increasing employment, because the youth unemployment problem in many of these countries is horrendous.
Well, let me pick up that, because already some of you are emailing in, and I'm more than happy to take a microphone as well. But Michel Ozan from UCHAM of CEE, he's making this point and picking up on what you've just both said, the growing divide between leading political forces and a young, disgruntled generation. Suggestions for young future leaders on how to act, and there may be some new young leaders in this audience today. And can I invite also Yanis and also the Minister to come in on this critical question. But Angel Gurria, first of all.
Well, first of all, the young, especially the young, like the ones that are with us today, the young that are privileged to be well informed, to be well studied, who have opportunities, who have the privilege of a job, become a royal pain in the neck and make everybody accountable. If you don't like government, if you don't like the way trade unions are conducting their business, if you don't like the way businesses are conducting their business, and you don't like the way parliaments are conducting their business, stand up and say so.
But you're welcoming that, aren't you?
Absolutely. We don't only welcome it, we need it very badly, because the change in paradigm means all those that are out there looking inside have to tell us what it is, where we should be moving towards. We are probably too concerned about our own short-term issues to look at the ultimate destination, and you can help us there.
Minister, let me come to you. I know you have some other remarks to give, but on this particular point about the growing divide between leading political forces and a young, disgruntled generation, you're the politician here.
Whatever we need, whatever we do, we need a political legitimacy. That means as much as we might be focused on dealing with the crisis, we must not forget that our citizens understand what we do and support what we do. And all the measures we undertake must follow the democratic procedures. Otherwise, we will not succeed. And we sometimes tend to forget the fact that we act upon a democratic mandate and without public support for measures which are not popular.
But you're deeply conscious of this in Slovakia, are you, as a politician?
Absolutely. And this is also one of the building blocks which the European Union is promoting, namely the democratic legitimacy of all the measures we are undertaking right now. Sometimes we tend to forget about it, but it's really very important we keep reminding each other about this.
And Commissioner, let me just ask you, how much is your policy making and your policy recommendations, how much are they now fashioned as much by your awareness of this new voice awareness and the digital generation which is out there, which is really keeping everyone's feet to the fire?
It's actually something which I wanted to say also in my introductory remarks, but very much because I'm a believer in young generation. I think the problem of today's world is not irresponsiveness of the young leaders, it's irresponsiveness of us, adult leaders, and we are the ones who basically have to change our attitudes and approach. And I think they have enormous power, which we will feel all together in the future on our chest, and that's the power of the social media. I think that social media in the future will be one of the decisive moments which will actually create a pressure that us politicians and also in economic sectors will not be able so much to concentrate on short-term but rather on long-term activities.
And Suma Chakrabarti, the natural assumptions of the global order being top-down, what is the perception you have, whether it be formally as a British civil servant or now as a president of the European Bank, looking at this region, looking at the 63 member nations, and looking now elsewhere where there have been revolutions recently?
My biggest worry...
Microphone, please.
My biggest worry would be that there's growing public disaffection with leaderships of all sorts. And amongst the most disaffected are the young, partly because of unemployment, but partly also because they do not see leaders taking tough action. And I think my advice to the young, particularly, would be the same advice I guess all of us took for ourselves when we were young, which is get organised and protest. Some of us, for me, apartheid was a big issue when I was young. Protesting against that sort of thing does make a difference. Leaders do notice. So it's worth young people getting organised and doing so. But in an organised way, and engaging, I think, very strongly, I agree with the Minister, in an organised way, engaging through proper political processes and so on, but putting pressure on us leaders to try and change policies.
Does it have to be generationalist, to coin a phrase? You're talking about the young. It's actually everyone who's out there who feels disaffected.
It is. I'm talking about the young simply because it was mentioned. But no, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, whole issues around pension reform, the ageing populations and so on, these are all there as well. So as people live longer, they also need to shape their own futures as well, whatever their age group. And cohorts come in different things. Generally, what I'm noticing is organised political parties in the West are no longer the only organising principle. So I think it's very important to organise around interests, around interest groups and so on, and push your agenda.
I'm not going to do you out of your prepared remarks, Commissioner, but already we're getting quite a few thoughts on this, like Brian Ebel from the Embassy of Canada. How much of the crisis is due to the inefficiency of political decision-making? How much does economic reform depend upon reform of governance structures to permit leadership to act more swiftly? You're nodding, Minister. Or Minister, let me go to the... well,
Yeah. Who?
You're nodding, Minister.
I'm nodding because I agree. We might have instruments, we might have proposals, but we need political will. We need vision, and we need resolve, and we need to act in unity. That's really important. We need to think strategically, regardless of incoming local or parliamentary elections in this or that country, because this is certainly the way which will bring us nowhere. So that's really important, to understand what's the priority. And the priority is to regain the confidence of our citizens, of our markets. The priority is really to set ourselves on the right path.
Commissioner, on this particular point.
On this particular point, I basically agree. So I think these are the things on which one has to focus. So I have no problem with that.
Nick, 18 out of the 34 countries that form the OECD today have changed governments in the time of the crisis.
How long are you measuring that?
I'm 3 to 4 years, but saying basically most of them changed to the alternative, meaning it was not just the usual logical time when they had to renew the leadership with the same. Mostly there were changes to the alternatives, and the only thing, there were right-wing people, left-wing people, there were weak coalitions and strong coalitions, and there were women and men and younger and older. The only thing they had in common was the crisis. The crisis is terrible for the incumbents. And that is why, when you were talking about the paradigm, you were talking about the leadership.
I'm quoting you.
It is extremely, extremely difficult. That is why this is relevant. This is why this question of facing the new paradigm and acting with leadership instead of letting things drive you, rather getting things by the scruff of the neck and leading events is important. Because if you don't, next election time, or even before that, you will be set aside in exchange for maybe an unknown, sometimes for wrong options, for bad options, but it doesn't matter. Today, the option is for something different because we don't like what we got.
Suma Chakrabarti, of course, you're dealing as well with Central Asia. Do you see a new form of politics emerging, or is it a refinement or an entrenchment of what is essentially in the DNA of the traditional political class?
I actually haven't personally yet engaged with Central Asia, so it's slightly premature for me to comment, but let me have a go at it, nevertheless. I think in Central Asia, a different form of democracies are coming out. You can see more pluralistic sort of democracy, but not necessarily a great challenge to the established governments as such. So what you're seeing is, I think, businesses, voluntary groups and so on, challenging that sort of order, but not in the way that we might understand Western Europe in terms of elections and so on. That isn't happening.
Right. Commissioner, I think I've asked you to pause for long enough. Why don't you give us some of your further thoughts? I hope you see the way this discussion is going. We've got another hour to run, so please keep the ideas coming in of how you'd like to contribute to this debate, wherever you are in the whole matrix of all these issues. And if you want to speak from the floor, please, there are microphones as well. Get them to you as fast as you can. Commissioner.
Thanks, Nick. Actually, this is a moment for a proper dobar dan to everybody, and I'm really pleased to be here. I have actually prepared quite a serious speech, which you could later on find on my internet page. But I would like to draw your attention to something which actually Angel started with his pointing, or also Nick started with his pointing on this change of paradigm. I will start by a quote which is recent, a few months old, from journal Nature, and it stated as follows. Today, conditions are very different because global-scale forcings, including but not limited to climate change, have emerged as a direct result of human activities. Human population growth, per capita consumption rate underlie all the other present drivers for the global change. And I think it's really important that we do not oversee the situation that we are seeing in 2050. It will be minimum 9 billion population, and even more what is important. McKinsey is, for example, estimating that in 2030 we will have 3 billion of additional mid-class consumers on the markets. So this is happening in the time when we are already heavily struggling with the resources which we have. For example, to give you just some data, the demand for food, feed and fiber is projected to increase 70%. Yet already today, 60% of all our ecosystems underpinning those resources are downgraded. Or shocking, without important efficiency gains, by 2030, we will need 40% more water than we can actually access. To put it simply, the world has changed. We are more interconnected, more interdependent than ever. Many challenges like climate change, like biodiversity disappearing, scarce resources, water, land, oceans, potential pandemics, poverty, global security can only be addressed if we really join the forces. And I think we are altogether forced to think how we change our resource-intensive growth model to a more resource-efficient growth model. It is not something on which we can choose. It is simply inevitable. So, of course, there one can discuss the industrial part of the world versus emerging economies, and I can talk about that if you wish later. But what I want to do is really to point that in Rio de Janeiro, when we all together gathered, we have discussed those issues. These were the issues which were rightly on the agenda. And you have heard that many are seeing Rio de Janeiro is the failure. And in fact, I would personally like to see better outcome. But to be really fair, I think that the success or failure of Rio was not decided in June 2012. It will be decided in the years to come. There are many things which we have seen there, a lot of new energy, a lot of positive investment went to Rio. We have had quite an agreement about concept of the green economy. We have adopted sustainable production and consumption, 10-year plan. We have agreed about necessity to go beyond GDP concept. We have agreed about committing to natural capital accounting. We have agreed about sustainable development goals. All those things are vital for future development of the humankind. So, in Rio, what we found out is that, of course, in the futures, we will be partners and competitors. But we will be forced to be more partners than competitors if we will like to safeguard the things on which we are having to focus in the future. I would dare to guess that in the future, strategic partnerships will be more, these partnerships will be more than in the past, built around resources, with large, resource-rich countries with relatively low population density on one side and highly populated, resource-poor countries on the other side. So how to manage these existing limited resources, water, land, energy, oceans, raw materials, biodiversity, ecosystems, and the complexity among them, I think it's the question of the future. In the past, we were never so seriously forced, at least globally, to deal with these questions. And we have advanced in our ability to provide for consumer needs, eradicate and treat diseases, live longer, handle natural disasters, and wage wars. And we have done all this on a planet that has stayed of the same size. Whilst we can achieve a lot by directing our technological, innovative capacities to getting more out of those limited resources, it will not be enough. We will have to rethink our existing development model. If I shift shortly to the European Union now, where we are, of course, we are struggling with financial, economic, and even political crisis. Of course, we are at the same time part of the world which I was talking in the introduction. So I think it's extremely important that while we focus on financial consolidation, which is absolutely necessary, that we do also put a renewed drive for sustainable growth, which is now sweeping across Europe. The build-up of debts and deficits, imbalances in our economies did not happen overnight. It happened over many years. And the readjustment we are now going through won't be concluded overnight either. There is no silver bullet for the economic growth. If there were, it would already have been fired. So financial and economic consolidation must be achieved whilst dealing with the structural problems and strengthening the competitiveness of European economy. Consistent policies and patience. One of the most, if not the most important answer for me, is to put knowledge-based, resource-efficient, low-carbon economy in the center of our political action and activity. The same green economy we were talking about in Rio de Janeiro. So, while we are really, you know that I'm responsible for environment, but those things which I'm telling you, of course, they are connected with safeguarding environment in the future. but at the same time, they are very much also in the heart of the competitiveness, especially of the continent which we are living on. Why? Why? There are three basic reasons why Europe should really go fiercely in this direction. The first is we have lived on the decades of intense brown growth. We use 16 tons of materials per person per year. We throw away 6 tons, and half of that 6 tons we landfill. Second, those resources are getting more and more expensive. From the beginning of this century, this is the trend which will stay there, and the prices are extremely volatile, as you know. And third, we are one of the major importers of the raw materials and also of the energy. More than half of the materials that we use are imported. Indeed, we import 6 times more than we export. We have the world's highest net imports of resources per person. So, in fact, what we are seeing in the economic world is that economy has already started to adapt. We are seeing that companies are refocusing from labor productivity today a lot their innovation potential onto the resource productivity. And public authorities, I think we should focus, of course we should be in the lead, of course we should give the leadership there. We should refocus from the concept which was in the past, command, control, compliance, into a new concept of 3 E's, innovation, incentive, and integration. As the situation is today, market forces are simply too slow and imperfect. And financial, business, economic world takes too short-term view, and politicians tend to work too tightly around electoral cycles. The role of the market also in the future will be crucial. It will be central, but there are a lot of market failures. Prices do not reflect the true costs of resources. Rewards to capital are disproportionate to other inputs. Managers are rewarded on annual contracts and are induced to make short-term investment decisions. Directors' business decisions are overly influenced by bonuses based on short-term expertise. So what do we need to do in Europe? Give clear signals to the private sector. Don't kill the industry with kindness. We need both. We need creative destruction and at the same time innovative creation. We need transition which is effective, smooth, and absolutely just. We need to remove environmentally harmful subsidies. We need to shift taxes from jobs to pollution. We need to support eco-industries. We need to push the things like corporate sustainability index. To conclude, I think it's difficult to claim that in those difficult times when we are all focusing on growth and jobs that we should not do that. I think that's right. But while we are doing that, it would be a fatal mistake if we would in this not focus also on the challenges with which I basically started my introduction. As basically Angel stated in G20 opening, changing our model of growth and making it greener and more inclusive, it's the only credible strategy we actually have. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because I'm seeing also in the business world that they are understanding that. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development is actually asking for regulation, norms, standards, codes of conduct, so that the frontrunners who have developed and pioneered the solutions are rewarded with lower barriers and entry risks. Similarly, we have to listen more to the voice of long-term investors, like pension funds. And we need industry and investors on board. Rather than fighting the power of capital or trying to legislate away its environmental downsides, we need to harness market forces to turn economies onto a track of sustainable economic, financial, and environmental future, green economics. Achim Steiner, my good friend, and I'm sure that good friend also of some others here on the panel, has actually stated recently, responding to some of Rio Plus 20 critics, we have failed to turn things around in the past 20 years, but underneath that failure, there is an extraordinary array of activity and innovation. 20 years ago, we agreed what to do. Now we have to do it. If we not go into the heart of economic policy, we will meet here in Rio Plus 40 even more culpable. Markets are social constructs. They are not forces like the gravity. They can and should be governed. And the last message which I want to share with you is it is imperative for me that we address the prevailing short-term logic which is built in all our systems, be it political or be it economic? Do you happen to know a politician that has been re-elected because she or he was defending longer-term interests over the short-term interests? Do you happen to know a manager who was rewarded because the profits of his or her company were lower that year but more sustainable in the longer term? It is of the fundamental importance that we build more long-term logic into our data collection, reporting systems, rewarding mechanisms, decision-making processes. I'm convinced that one cannot manage the world of the 21st century without taking into account the longer-term picture and also the longer-term consequences. Doing that would be simply self-destructive. Thank you.
Commissioner, you've put on the table some incredibly important issues there about the low-carbon economy, about changing the model of growth, and also about the dilemma for politicians and senior executives when it comes to long-term sustainability. Can we park those? And I know Summa would like to come in, and I think Angela as well. Can I just ask for the Minister, what would you like to put on the agenda at this stage, so at least I know what else we've got to cover in the next 45 minutes?
Okay, well, while the three other panelists represent organizations or institutions, I'm bringing the national perspective here, and what I want to speak about is the biggest challenge for a country like mine, which is the European Union in state of health. Secretary General Gura mentioned that 18 out of 34 OECD governments fell because of the crisis. Mine was one of them, and that's why I'm sitting here in the current capacity as a result of early elections. And what's important here is that the European Union is a global player. EU's performance is vital not only for 500 million citizens of the European Union, but it's also important for OECD, for the G20, and for the global economy. EU economy is the strongest economy in the world in the terms of GDP, stronger than the one of the US, or much stronger than the combined GDP of Russia, Brazil, India, and China. So everybody is looking at the European Union and expecting us to be able to find the way out of the current crisis. We are, as you mentioned at the very beginning, Nick, we are watching statements and reading in newspapers every day bringing some gloomy scenarios, some of them sentencing Euro and even the EU to death, which is not helpful, I believe. The situation is very, very serious, but it's solvable, and the solution is in our hands because we have all the instruments and we have all the responsibility. So this is the most important, to understand that the blame or shame each other will not help. We need to find a way out. For this, we have to follow certain principles. First of all, the current crisis is first and foremost the crisis of confidence. We have not lost our economic power, but we have lost the confidence of markets in our ability to deal with the crisis. And in order to regain this confidence, we have to respect the rules of the game. That's really important. We have adopted some time ago the Growth and Stability Pact, and we have violated it more than 60 times with no repercussions. So we cannot continue functioning like this. It's clear that after this crisis, Europe will have to be much more integrated, much more than we've ever thought about. But that's the only way. We cannot have one currency and 17 monetary policies and fiscal policies. That's also obvious. But again, what should be the basic principles? I would mention two: responsibility and solidarity. One has to be responsible with each other, with yourself, and with others. That means if we have accepted certain commitments, we have to honor the commitments. We have to do our homework. And this is the only way how we can be a part of the solution rather than part of the problem. In case of my country, Slovakia, our projection for the next year would be minus 4.6% budget deficit. But we have to be below 3%, because this is the European commitment. So we are doing it. It's painful, it's unpopular. You are not gaining or winning votes for that. But that's the only way how we can do it. And then we can participate in the debates trying to find a solution. And the solidarity. Solidarity is the core principle of the European integration. But you have to do your homework first in order to ask the other solidarity. You cannot be solidary with those who are not responsible. When I go to my parliament and ask for the increase of the European Stability Mechanism to generate more funds to help the countries in need, it's impossible for me to do it when I'm mentioning countries who have not convinced that they are doing their utmost to overcome the crisis. So these principles are extremely important, and we can have brilliant ideas, but if we do not follow and honor the basic principles, we will never succeed. So now, speaking about the concrete steps Of course, first and foremost, we have to implement already adopted instruments and mechanisms. We have the European Fiscal Pact, which is a good document, but we have to make sure that it's not going to follow the fate of the Growth and Stability Pact. We basically agreed that the banking union is inevitable. Here, the question is how to find the balance between the national responsibility and the EU-wide responsibility. Fiscal union will logically follow. Political union, when and how far, but again, it's something we cannot continue in strengthening our economic integration without strengthening and empowering our political integration. So this is what we have to do. But there are other things. European free market, we have not used the potential of the free market to its full extent. We have to do it. Europe has always benefited from the free trade. So we have to continue promoting free trade agreements. And, for example, the membership of Russia in the WTO offers a good new possibilities for all of us. So these are the instruments which are here, and we have to use them following the principles that I mentioned. At the same time, we must understand that Europe has been always very strong by leading by example. And this must continue. I do believe that the world around...
Do you believe that's at risk at the moment?
Yes, it is. It is, because we are very much involved into our own problems. We have less time, less capacities, less resources to address the problems around us. But the world around us needs us, particularly our neighbors to the south, the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and to the east, the countries of Eastern Partnership, but also wider. So Europe is a global player, and if we make our place vacant, then of course it's felt we are missing there. So we really need to bring our acts together, and we have to make sure that we are the player, the world is used for us to be a player. So I think these are the key messages, key principles. I don't believe in doomsday scenarios, because we need Europe, we need European Union, so it cannot fail. But we really have to show the resolve, and we have to focus on big issues, on strategic issues, and not on the daily political issues, because this will get us nowhere.
Well, let's pick up on those strategic issues we heard from the Commissioner in a moment. Let me give you an idea of the kind of thoughts that there are in the minds of some of the delegates here. Governments have difficulty to explain why measures are necessary, how to explain pension reform is necessary in times of employment, but how to make pensions sustainable for young generation who get disillusioned. That from Jos Duma, the Dutch ambassador. We have one from Barbara Belozerski, CEO of O&R here in Slovenia. Goria mentioned reform should continue to be implemented by politicians who are elected by the citizens. What should be done when the public opinion becomes hostile for the necessary reforms that should be taken? There's a theme developing here. And from the ambassador of Argentina, nobody has addressed yet the changing global order from the most basic element, the essence in political life and history, power, and the fight for it among states and blocs in new dimensions in the next decades. So other things have been put on the agenda as well. I'll come back to those towards a bit later on in this session. But let me ask you to respond to those as well as what the Commissioner has put on the table about the lower carbon economy must be at the heart of economic activity. And also, we need to change our model of growth and the behaviour of politicians and senior executives in companies. Who'd like to pick that up? Summer, I think you wanted to come in.
Let me try and unite some of those very big themes together. I think the first thing, I very much agree with where the Commissioner is coming from on this. I think one of my biggest worries about the current crisis is that people want to go back to a model of development, if you like, which is very industrial, outdated, and actually not green in any way. So increasingly we see in many countries go green is almost put against go growth. Actually, they can go together and be made to work together. The EBRD does a lot of this through its Sustainable Energy Initiative. Energy efficiency reduces costs in terms of energy intensity of production, actually increases profits for many companies. So we are pushing this as a single agenda, not a separate agenda. And actually, we need to talk very frankly, I think, both to politicians who try to separate the two, but also, frankly, to some of the industrialists who are also beginning to push them as separate. I think they're the same thing. And I think here, the young really do have a big role to play. The best recycler in my family is my 16-year-old daughter. And, she pushes this agenda far more strongly and feels it far more strongly. It's her apartheid agenda, just as that was for me. And it's a really important thing. I think I want to pick up on those big themes. I think I fully agree with you, Minister, about responsibility, solidarity, as a way of actually trying to build a consensus beyond political cycles, which is a real problem for all of us. And it's somehow to have a conversation about the long term and not about 4 years nor 5 years. These problems are huge. They're not going to be solved in 4 or 5 years. So it requires an honesty. And firstly, obviously, political parties have to get together and agree this is in their national interest. And the national interest, frankly, should be more important than the party interest. And where politicians have done that, it has made a major difference, I think. And you can pick examples in countries where that has happened, actually. And I think increasingly, I've been today talking to the Prime Minister here. Clearly, Slovenia is trying to do that, trying to build that national consensus around change. It's been very difficult. And I think the same in Slovakia. So it is possible, but it's bloody hard.
Angel Gurria.
Well, first of all, on the question of on the question of green growth, not only do they go well together, they must go well together, because otherwise we have no choice. As I was happy to see the Commissioner quoting my opening to the G20, but I really do believe we have no choice. It's the only way to go. It's the only credible way to go. The truth is, as I suggested before, we are on a collision course with nature. And the truth also is that there's a very serious intergenerational responsibility here, because when the 16-year-olds, who today are very good recyclers, are going to be handling things after we're gone from the scene, what kind of legacy are they going to find? The decisions that we take today in terms of productive structure, productive capacity, and, even just doing away with... Today, there are many countries that still subsidize fossil fuel consumption and production, both in developing countries as well as in developed countries. Not only are we not taxing them, we should put a big price on emissions. Carbon is the enemy. Carbon dioxide is the enemy. We know that's the enemy. We should hit it with a blunt instrument on the head. We should put a big price on it. No, sometimes we, including my own country, we subsidize it, So we are far away, from having a single way of doing it. The recent Australian linkage with the EU in terms of their trading schemes, their emissions trading schemes, is very, very welcome news. But still, you are burning today most of the corn crop in the world when the price of corn is flaring up, and where there's a great scarcity because of the droughts in the United States and other parts of the world, and you're burning it instead of, giving it for people to eat it or feed animals that are then going to become food for people themselves. So there seems to be a very great disconnect when we're talking about the environment, when we're talking about the way in which we allocate what are, by definition, scarce resources, and still the question of national interest. Why would, in the Bush era in the United States, they were eliminating tons of carbon dioxide at $1,000 per ton because they were subsidizing the ethanol, where in the UK or in the EU trading scheme they were at $23 or $25. So why go to $1,000? Well, because you did not use the concept of energy efficiency. You used energy independence. And that changed the whole equation. You would pay anything, Of course, it's all wrong. It's a bad allocation of the resources. But so there's still a very great challenge in terms of getting our act together and looking at the way in which we can escape from this collision course in which we are. We are condemned now to go beyond the 450 particles per million, as I said, and we are going to take longer and more expensive to get back on the right track to keep warming at the 2 degree limit.
Angel Gurria, can I just come in? You are very specific in these warnings and have been for several years in the OECD. It's there in your documentation. You've also warned that this could takes second place when it comes to the economic priorities now. How do you see the political class responding to this absolute demand that this be done, a new form of growth, when the political realities short-term are rather different?
Well, you're absolutely right. But they say, listen, Korea, come on, green jobs. Give me black jobs,
I
Give
didn't
me
put it
brown
like that.
jobs, yellow jobs, checker jobs, striped jobs, any kind of job, This is, we can't afford the luxury, because the options today are for growth, and green and growth don't work together. Wrong. We are missing the point completely. First of all, the only way to go is with the green growth scenario. And second, the costs of inaction are much greater, including to the treasuries of the governments, than any known action path. And therefore, the apparent conflict between green and growth, which Suma said, we've solved it, they have to go, well, that's not quite there yet in terms of the minds of the people. And it's certainly not there yet in terms of the minds of the industrialists, in terms of the minds of business, sometimes not even there yet in terms of the minds of the unions, So we do have to work a lot in order to introduce this notion, sell it well, and then act accordingly, because the green growth path is, as Commissioner said before, not a way to go, not the way to go, the only way to go.
And Suma, can I just be clear, from the European Bank's point of view, is there always an environmental conditionality to all money you put into the market?
Well, it depends what sort of project, but for those projects that are relevant, yes. It's part of all our... So we actually have we track every year the amount we're spending in terms of sustainable energy. And actually it's tracked and reported on in our scorecard, because we care so much about this. So if you find any of the energy, infrastructure, those sorts of loans where it's very relevant, it's always in there.
And just getting back, Angel, I think you wanted to make a second point. Was it about the changing model of growth, and also how you change the mindsets of the politicians and the company directors, who up to now are judged by certain kinds of delivery?
Yes, and by the way, this is the Slovenian Environmental Performance Review, which we delivered to the Minister and to the government here. And this is, of course, coupled with the Slovenian review of innovation policy, because this is, of course, clearly linked to this. Innovation will lead to the better ways of dealing with the environment. And the problem, Nick, you're absolutely right. The results by which people are measured and by which people are remunerated, actually, both politically...
This came from the Commissioner, of course, not from me.
As well as in terms of, actual money being paid out, are wrong in terms of the incentives. Just like we're trying to change the banks thing in order to move it to medium and long-term issues, responsible issues, measure long-term results rather than the quarterly results, etc. This is the kind of thing we should be doing, and certainly when we're allocating public resources and things like subsidies or things like support for certain policies, etc., these things should be taken into consideration. The medium and the long term are our business. We have to deal with the short term, solve the debt problems of Europe, etc. Use the ECB to the greatest possible extent. For heaven's sakes, it's there. Use it. It's a bazooka. It's a muscle. It's a powerful weapon, etc. Yes, but when you're talking about the medium and the long term and our responsibility as leaders, and when you're talking about the next generation, these other considerations have to be taken into account. And as I said, I think we're going to pay a high price if we don't.
Commissioner, is this the kind of language you want to hear? Because I've got a point here from Jene Sekolec, an expert in international trade law, saying the EU, the EBRD, the OECD offer standards to be followed by Eastern European countries in their legislative and policy reforms. How receptive are the national governments?
That's not to flatter the OECD, but the OECD has done really with the green growth an excellent job. I think it's remarkable what you are doing, and I think it's even more remarkable because it's coming from the industrial part of the world. Because I have mentioned in my introduction that this dilemma, industrial developing countries, it's of course a real and serious dilemma. So first and foremost, it's on the industrial part of the world to change the consumption and the production patterns of growth. And of course, it's on the developing part, the ones of 3 billion, which I spoke before, that they do not repeat some of the mistakes which we have done in the past. So both have our job to do, but it's of fundamental importance that we do it jointly. Having a kind of being convinced that actually one can, with 9 billion of population, repeat the growth model over the whole population of the globe like we have developed it in the past, it's simply false. It's not possible. It's with the limited resources which you have, and talking about water or talking about land or talking about oceans, fish or whatever, talking about that, it's simply impossible to repeat it on the global scale. So we all together have to think seriously to change it. And one of the things which you mentioned in the public opinion and all those stories which we are discussing also when we have to convince people, I think it's of fundamental importance from our side, politicians, also when we are dealing with these questions of growth and jobs of today, that we are honest and that we think and put on the agenda also the things like we are discussing today. It's a rare opportunity that you, like here today, we are discussing on a strategic forum those issues. It's a very rare opportunity, which is unfortunate, because these are the vital things which will decide the very life of those people today who are fighting for their jobs and growth.
Because I remind you what Barbara Bolezewski said, yes, CEO of O&R here in Slovenia. What should be done when the public opinion becomes hostile for the necessary reforms that need to be taken? This comes down to the root of what we're talking about, leadership and political risk, yes, and the time scale.
Yes, absolutely.
Let me go to the Minister.
I'd like to be the devil's advocate here for a while. I agree with everything that was said. But
microphone, please. Start again.
Sorry. I'd like to provoke a debate here a bit and to be a devil's advocate. I agree with everything that was said, but the fact is that all the governments are struggling in fighting the proper balance between the budgetary cuts and restarting the growth, which is not easy. And in this situation, there are industries that are coming and saying, European Union has been recognized standard setter in the environmental protection, technological standards, so on and so forth. But this makes us less competitive on the global scene. This is what people say. And this is what I hear from politicians. Isn't this time of crisis a time to suspend, for example, some of our progress in these areas to help our industries to recover faster and to be more competitive? So I have no answer what's right or what's wrong. I know what's right from the moral ground and from the strategic point of view. At the same time, these voices are here. So it would be interesting also for me to hear from our public how they see the situations. So that means we shall not abandon our standards, but probably suspend them for a year or two, or not progress any further into promoting these standards, just to help our European industries to be more competitive.
Commissioner.
Actually, it has to go hand in hand, and it's simply not true. I have, by the way, here in my papers also as much as examples of you wish from calculations which were done, how actually this could be profitable if you go. It doesn't make sense to make a product with using less energy, using less water, and using less material. Isn't that economic sense?
But how do you convince people? I've heard you and your predecessors talking about this, and many others. There's economic success drilled deep into this.
But it's no need that you convince people. You have to produce the products in that way, and that's how they will be convinced. I think it's absolutely... But on the other hand, what is important is to frankly talk about those questions. If we don't start to deal with those questions, this will be on the very table of the same people in the years to come very soon, and then we will have the real crisis. So at the same time, when you deal with the financial crisis, you have to think not only about quantity of growth, but also the quality of growth. Which jobs you are supporting, which loans you are giving. These are the right questions. And by the way, if you want an excellent example, and I think Angel has mentioned it and you also, environmentally harmful subsidies. Isn't this good for budgets? Isn't it good for recovery of the budgets if we remove them? But why don't we remove them? Then ask that question. This is the real political question which has to be asked.
Well, let's keep asking that question in the next half hour. There's a point here from Ksenia Shkrilec. Could we say that sustainability is a new paradigm? It's just disappeared. Never mind. Could we say that sustainability is a new paradigm?
I would agree with that sustainability is a new paradigm, but not environmental sustainability. Sustainability of economies, of economics, sustainability of social systems and environmental systems. Because what happened actually in economic system is that we have had the balloons which exploded in our face, and now we are actually doing the things because economic systems and economic paradigms were not sustainable.
And
that
the
was
second
our
half of that, is this a cornerstone of being successful? The paradigm of sustainability?
It's a cornerstone of existence in the future. Part of that is, of course, success of that story.
Angel Gurria, I come back to your lost paradigm as I press you to answer this one. Deleveraging on the financial scale is necessary, is in your documentation, but bringing confidence and growth back requires more than just austerity. Is this a new way of creating new confidence or not? We're being asked to think more frankly and more imaginative on this platform today.
Yes, and let me take the opportunity to very strongly and respectfully disagree with the minister who was, as he warned, being the devil's advocate. He did a good job of that, because it is exactly the opposite that will lead you to medium and long-term credibility and medium and long-term. Maybe if the only thing you want to do is get elected in the next 3 months or 6 months, well, I would say, but I think today people have enough information, and that's part of our responsibility, spreading around enough information so that people take learned decisions. And, you know, the young were saying, what do I do? It's spread the word around, tweet and Facebook and whatever you do so that people understand that things like saying, we will delay the decisions to go green because we actually are in a recession. Well, that's exactly the time when you should accelerate, the whole process of going green rather than stretching it longer. No, we should not stop. We should not, because then we're going to be finding every step of the way a very good excuse not to do things. Actually, what we should do is press on, change the urgency, the emergency, keep on doing these things. Now, you're saying about the credibility and the leadership. Reforms breed the credibility. Reforms breed the confidence and the trust which today is missing. Reforms are the ones that give the narrative, the story to tell. The reforms are the ones that say something's going on in Slovenia, or something's going on in Croatia, something going on in Turkey or in Mexico or in Italy. They are pressing on with the reforms. They're not waiting for reciprocity in order to open the economy. They're not waiting for growth to recover before they go on and before they go green. They are not waiting to make more flexible labor markets, or they're not waiting to modernize and make more powerful their financial markets. So they're not waiting. They're not waiting. They are leading. They are understanding the change of the paradigm, and that they're saying this is the way to go about it. And I can tell you there will be political rewards here. I can understand the political realities, and I can see why everybody's gone, there are so many governments changing. But you have to understand, we are facing the biggest economic crisis in our lifetimes. I can't compare it with the Depression of the 30s. It's irrelevant. There was another world completely. We are facing the greatest. It's 5 years into the crisis already, maybe a 6th year coming in 2013. And it's about time that instead of looking at the short-term convenience and the thing, we really take, maybe some of those leaders have gone because they did not lead, because they did not dare go against the conventional wisdom, and they did not dare to educate their public against the general beliefs and the devil's advocates of the world, and take risks. But then I'm sure many of them would have been rewarded, because many of them were pushed aside because of indecisiveness and because of lack of direction.
So, Angel, I have to ask you, what is the... I'm not recording the volume of the clapping here, but what is the prescription for Gurria's glory, political glory? in the future if you do this? Because that surely is not the way politicians see it at the moment, sadly.
More and more, it has to be the way. And it is because evidence is pointing towards the need to go there. And evidence is also pointing towards greater and greater contradictions in the way we used to do things if we continue to do them in a certain way or in a certain way. I mean, take away this golden rule thing that we're discussing here in Slovenia, very relevant issue, okay? Everybody went there. Who went there first? The Germans didn't even have to be asked. They didn't even discuss it. They just put in the Constitution in 2009. The Italians, the Spanish were kind of forced to do it, but now they're there. And here, there's this option of whether you go to a law or whether you go to the Constitution. Why should you even discuss it? What takes away more votes? What gives you more votes? I think the question of the options today in every policy option, and this is not a Guria recipe, but I think it's utter common sense. Communication, translation, education, sharing of why people are taking the decisions and where this is going to lead us. This is why we are suggesting today the best short-term medicine today are structural changes. My God, you say, that always takes years. No. That's because today, if you understand what you're doing, if you explain what you're doing, if you explain the logic and the costs and the very positive risk rewards that are happening later, then people will support you, even in the next election.
We've got 20 minutes to run. If anyone wants to use a microphone, please grab a microphone. You wanted 2 or 3 here. But let me ask, and this, Suma, is not a trap because you've just been in Serbia, but I put this on the table, at least so you know what is being thought out there, and any of you can comment. This from Mila Tanaskovic. In Serbia, 1 kilowatt hour costs 0.60 euro, in other words, 60 cents. In the EU, it costs 3 euros. There is no incentive to go green because it would take 10 years for the companies in Serbia to get the money back, unlike in the European Union, where it can take 3 to 4 years. This is why there are no big green projects in a place like Serbia.
Well, as it just so happens, and I can't name the project, we are working on a huge project in Serbia which is got sustainability built into it, largely because many Serbians have seen the point that the Commissioner made, that actually it is profitable in the long term to switch to a more green approach. So I don't think that's correct, actually. These economies are very, very energy intensive. That's extremely expensive economically, and therefore to reduce energy intensity, you have to go a different way. And so I think actually, both from a company point of view, sector point of view, and an economy point of view, it's the right way to go. I want to just come back on this question of politics. I mean, I've spent most of my life working with politicians while I was in the British Civil Service, and I think I've met politicians who do think long-term, actually, but I've also met, obviously, politicians who are just got their eye on the next election. But politicians, even like that, frankly, respond to incentives. The incentives are what will get them elected, and if they feel there's a pressure from a group that is really very, very important and is changing the dynamics of the debate, they do respond. Which goes back to the point about, if we feel this is a really important issue, we all clearly do, then organising actually to push this agenda is really important. It did not, exactly as Andel said, it did not make politicians in the UK popular when they stopped talking about the green agenda because of the growth problem. It did not make them any popular at all. So I don't think this is actually a long-term, good strategy. I think it is a good strategy to pick up on the green agenda because it brings the youth back into the electorate from which they become disaffected.
Commissioner, those figures.
Yeah, I would just say times of low energy prices and low resource prices are over. So
Okay.
You will have still differences between the countries, but the general trend will be up. And
Right.
I think it's fair to say that loudly because the companies need to accommodate to that. And that's why I was talking before that, for example, in Germany today, the amount which companies are paying for resources, it's approximately double to the amount which they are paying for the labor force. So with supporting the labor productivity in the 20th century, we came as far that today we have factories which don't use workers anymore, but resources are there. And since the resources are more and more scarce, since the situation in this century is totally different than it was in the previous with all global developments, the focus on the resource productivity, it's absolute must. It's the cornerstone of productivity and competitiveness of the country.
All right. A lot of you want to come in. I'm going to ask you to express things as simply and as straightforwardly as I've got here in 3 or 4 sentences. Who's got the microphone at the back, please? And could you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Alfred Horn from Germany. Good evening. I'd like to make a comment in the framework of what you had discussed. Is this a generational problem? And the other one is, are we talking about a gap and a dilemma for the politicians who want to be re-elected? Several of you mentioned that. How do you sell the bad news? So I would like, first of all, I'd like to say that in my perception, the two losing big groups of this crisis and of these repeated crises are not only the young, not only the indignados, but as well the old, the pensioners, in Germany, in Slovenia, wherever it cuts. So the problem is that we both, these two groups, hold the medium section, those active politicians, management people, directors, responsible for that.
Right,
and they don't feel, and how do you want to change that? They don't feel taken with proper respect.
Right. Notice he calls it bad news. Angel Gurria, just pick up on that. When you're saying it's actually good news, the paradigm that they could adopt.
Well, but I'm also saying if there are bad news to communicate, do so early in the context of an approach and a solution which will deal with the bad news. If you only give the bad news, please avoid any case where you're blaming somebody else from the outside is the oldest trick in the book. I think it's getting stale. I don't think it's working very much because in the end it's the politicians, it's the administration, it's you that are going to have to face it. So the bad news you share together with the proposed explanation of why this is happening, and second, what you're going to be doing about it. Now, yes, of course, it's also the elderly, but this is a crisis about young, unskilled male that are mostly having the problem in the crisis now with the unemployment. And when it comes to pensions, let me just make a final comment here. Which were the countries that had the most generous replacement rates for pensions and the least contributions that could retire early? Would you believe Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Slovenia, not bad. Which are the countries that had the unit labor costs in the last 12, 13, 15 years? UK, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal. Unit labor cost of Germany. This is the level. 10% above, starting at 100 in 99 or the year 2000. Nothing is a coincidence. And of course, if you have pension funds which are not financeable, which are going to eat in your budget instead of coming in from the created reserves that you have done over the time, then you have to adjust it, because the pay-as-you-go system for pensions is going to kill healthcare, kill education, kill infrastructure, etc., etc.
You're stimulating a lot of ideas on leadership, particularly. Let me just read another couple here. Should governments of today, for the sake of long-term survival, accept acting as kamikaze, that's doing what needs to be done in terms of austerity, and pay the price of losing their popularity and the next election? That's Rafiq Husseini. Marco Chehovin, one of the solutions to tackle young unemployment could be to reduce the number of working hours per week. Has the OECD ever tackled the measure as a recommendation to some countries? Quickly, half a minute.
Yes, we've done it. The Germans have done it. Kurzarbeit was used more in Belgium and Austria than even in Germany. Kurzarbeit, now everybody thinks it's going to be the biggest solution. It was actually not the real solution. It helped, but what helped in Germany is the great compact between, which is a cultural compact, a political compact between the unions, the private sector, and the government, which has been there for a long, long time, because the transformation which got Germany more competitive today did not start in the crisis. It started in the time of Schröder.
Would anyone on the panel agree with Kurzarbeit, shorter working week, or not?
I don't want to comment on this particularly, but I wanted to comment on the question you asked at the beginning. I really believe that it's important for political leaders to be responsible, to talk to their people, to be honest. It's so easy to see newly born prophets who are saying, I offer an easy way out. There is no easy way out. So this is an extraordinary situation, requires extraordinary measures, such as the nationwide strategies. This is not for the fight between the left and the right, but for the fights between the standard and responsible political parties across the board against those who are populists and who are offering something which is a catastrophe. That's really important.
Thank you. There are 3 or 4 microphones out there. One there, one here. There are 2 more, in other words. Please put your hand up and the microphone will come to you. I'm not going to mediate in a battle to get the microphone, but can you get the microphone to you, please?
Thank you, Nick. Andrew Page, British Ambassador in Slovenia. This has been a lot of very interesting conversation, particularly about paradigms. Maybe this session should be rechristened Paradigm Lost. And I want to ask about one very big paradigm this year. Right at the start of your introduction, Nick, you mentioned the one thing coming up is the US elections. We've had an hour and a quarter's debate with no mention of the United States. And are we being rather too introverted and focused on Europe? Of course, Europe is bigger than Brazil and Russia and India and China and so on in certain measures, but the United States dwarfs us all. And we've got a big election coming up. There are a lot of questions about short-termism and long-termism for the United States as well. And in the short time that remains, I'd be very interested in 1 or 2 views from the panelists on whether that might create a new paradigm, a paradigm regained.
Commissioner, are you across the Eurostats at the moment on this? I'm sure you read them every morning.
You have really chosen the right person. Yeah, of course, as Nick said, this is one of the things which we are following very closely. When we were working, of course, in Rio de Janeiro, we tried to get as much of understanding of United States on board, because it was, without them, it's simply impossible to do some of the global changes which are absolutely necessary. So, and we also see that in some ways it's difficult sometimes that not seeing the understanding of the challenges which we are globally facing in the same way as we are doing. But on the other hand, I would also not underestimate what is actually happening in the United States. On the states level, or when you go to the research level, or when you go to the business sector level, they are very quick, they act, react. If you will see, if companies there will see that that green future is actually the potential for future development, they will be acting fast, and I'm seeing already that this is happening.
Summa.
I think it's interesting Andrew mentioned the US election. I think Angel did mention the US. I think it's going 2 ways. One is, as the US election proceeds, I think the 2 main parties are basically looking to their core vote and therefore becoming quite inward-looking. And that's not great in terms of the agendas we've been discussing. At the same time, if you look at the last year or so, I agree with the Commissioner, I think the US government has actually engaged in these debates very productively, both in my institution and in others as well, and at Rio. So I think at the moment, as over the US election, I would aim off for what's going on right now. I would worry much more about it from January onwards, I think, in terms of what is their position to be. Can I add one word on all this? It's a bit odd to be talking about reshaped global order without actually talking about voice, in my view. The voice of smaller countries. We know about the G7, G8, we know about the G20. Actually, this region is full of course, members who are not members of either of those groups. And it's a big issue, I think, in the new order as to whether the voice of those people, those countries, becomes a bigger voice, where they can organise themselves to have more voice in international debates.
All right, quickly, Angel, on this particular question about the United States. We don't want to get into micropolitics over the next few weeks. We are talking about a new reshaping of the world order.
Well, the problem is they can't agree about the time of the day, and that's pretty important. because if they go into the so-called fiscal cliff, they're going to have a recession in the United States that can be either, 0.5% contraction to 1.5% contraction. So they better find a way in which they can, reduce the deficits and reduce the budget and the accumulated debt. The problem is we're going to have to go through the election before we actually get a good semblance of what goes on. And I would agree with Suma that, of course, it's a medium and the long term that we have to focus on. But in the United States, the problem today is mostly with governance rather than the question of substance. The United States is vital and vibrant and flexible, et cetera, but the governance is wrong. Now, let me just say something about the UK, Ambassador, and about the credibility and about taking tough decisions and biting the bullet. The UK has one of the toughest adjustment programs in the world. They're coming from an almost 10% deficit and a huge accumulated debt. It took a very big slowdown, and for some time unemployment rose, and every time they gave these numbers out and it looked bad, the questions were, shouldn't they release? Shouldn't they relax? Shouldn't they loosen up? Shouldn't they? And all the time we're saying, stay the course, stay the course, stay the course. Because the UK today is borrowing sometimes at less than the Germans, okay? Why is that? There is credibility. Even though they have a big budget deficit and they're bringing it down, even though they're not growing very much, even though they have high levels of unemployment, they have a program, they have enough detail that they passed on, they're sticking to the program, they're sticking to the calendar, and they're coming out with the right decisions, painful as they may be. And that credibility and the capacity then to build so that they can grow back later is much greater than the cost of the short term and the pain that is going on now because of the adjustment. Some countries simply ran out of time. The markets ran out of patience, and the threshold of patience of markets today is much lower.
Angel, let me just put to you, the OECD, your chief economist, on the 22nd of May said, Europe is the single greatest risk to the global economy. Is that still the view of the OECD?
Absolutely. And let me join my voice to Mr. Bernanke 2 days ago in Jackson
So it's not America?
Who said, in America, he was talking about the United States, but then said, and by the way, the question of Europe is becoming increasingly important for the solution of the U.S. problems. It is impinging more and more on the U.S. economy, on the U.S. stock market, on the U.S. business mood. So, yes, like everything else, you let it fester, it gets bad, and it starts to contaminate everything around it.
Well, Suma, you were speculating about developing countries. Let me just go to an Indian representative here, who I know because we met last night, is investing at this moment in Slovenia, normally working in the Punjab, a small pharmaceutical company. Quickly, your point in this discussion, please.
Well, Hello. Well, a very good afternoon to all of you. I'm from India, but since I live in Slovenia, so I welcomed you to Slovenia, Dobar dan. I would just like to point out that I would just like to take the panelists and the audiences a bit back, let's say about 3 years ago.
Don't go too far, please.
I won't be. Only 3 years.
I just want to know a point of why someone like you feels comfortable about investing in Europe at the moment.
Right. We have actually seen the Copenhagen conference, and it was a massive diplomatic failure. Since then, it's been 3 years. We haven't seen any progress into that area. The life is actually going down, which actually most of people would be happy about that. The people are not, willing to live more. But I would like to tell you that the environment is one of the most important issues, and none of the governments is actually, I don't think so, that they are serious about it. Also about the trade. We are talking about the crisis. It's not only the legal trade, which is creating the crisis. Did someone cut it? Okay. It's not only the legal trade which is actually creating the crisis. The illegal trade, tens of ships are entering India through, let's say, China or Taiwan, which are having the illegal goods. And that is one of the major parts, and which I don't see anyone has actually spoken about it. So actually, the legal trade is being taken over by the non-legal trade. And I would just like to have some comments like, how come we can actually afford the present leaders to gift, actually, seriously, a death to the future kids who would actually have no hesitation to blaming us as the betrayal of the world government. So how can you, as the current diplomats, find yourself into that betrayal part, like when the future kids would be actually commenting upon our non-incompetence?
Okay, thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Who else has got the microphone, please? Please, down here, yeah.
Dobar dan. Michele Ozan from UCHAM, European Chamber, a new organization, private organization representing businesses in Europe, with interest in Europe. We forgot one important topic. I personally love free market in general. But in my humble opinion, financial activity and speculation of concentrated capital grew too much far beyond a desirable level today. It's time to regulate it and rebalance probably it with the normal activity of companies and the real economy. Are our politicians afraid of finally strongly crack on tax havens, tax financial regulations, financial transactions, redistribute or better reinvest the income in green economy, real economy, in a real economy for real citizens? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just paraphrase that question from the new resident of Slovenia from India and ask you, Suma, about your assessment on the issue of corruption, particularly as we look east into some of the areas you're dealing with. And secondly, all of you, do you agree with what we've just heard, that issue about the public expectation on clamping down on financial irregularities and inappropriate activity? First of all, that first question, Suma.
On corruption, this is a big issue, undoubtedly, for most countries in the world, actually, and it's not just about this part of the world. As I said, I used to work in the UK, and as Nick knows very well, we had a nice expenses scandal in our UK Parliament, so it's different types of corruption. But what the key thing about this, it seems to me from a business perspective, is it really puts off business. It puts off the private sector development in a big way. So I applaud those countries that are trying to tackle corruption and trying to tackle corruption in a non-partisan way. It's very important. Some of the corruption efforts, some people would argue, have been directed at particular groups and particular parties. It's very important to be non-partisan about it and to have an independent commission, particularly in these countries, I think, looking at these issues. In the case of EBRD, we take this so strongly that we have really strong due diligence checks always before we get involved. And there are lots of people who, frankly, we don't do business with. And that's exactly as it should be.
Angel, this last other point. You monitor this kind of thing, public opinion.
First of all, on the question of corruption, it's anti-bribery. It's checking on your own companies, not to try to corrupt officials from other countries, but it's also a system of fighting corruption internally, fighting with more transparent government, with a very transparent and efficient procurement practices, and with accountability of the estate of officials, etc. There are instruments, the Anti-Bribery Convention of the OECD, the UNCAC of the United Nations and others, which are looking in this direction, and then a lot of governance issues which we have with every one of our member countries having to do with this. Now, let me just address the question of financial regulation. I think financial regulation is one of the areas where we have made more progress. There's a lot of discussion. Every day we have another headline because some bank is being chastised or a big fine is being paid for another different. But there's never been so much focus on the quality of the capital, on the fact that, you know, the too big to fail issue, the systemically important financial institutions, the focus on the question of whether they're laundering money or not laundering money, or whether, you know, this. Actually, my impression is that we have made a lot of progress, and we are going to continue to make a lot of progress. And by the way, you mentioned tax evasion. and tax, there has never been so much progress, and that we owe to the G20 in terms of there have been hundreds of bilateral agreements to fight tax evasion and tax elusion and tax havens. Now there's nowhere to hide, okay, today, and that's because the G20 decided that they would clamp on this. So here I am a much more sanguine and much more optimistic, but there's a lot of work to be done. But I don't think that, we can continue to repeat these mantras of a year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago, 10 years ago, saying, oh, terrible, the financial system, is full of Zurich gnomes that are conspiring to see how they get the most out of us. I don't think that it's longer the case. The question is, in the end, the financial system is not just about not going bankrupt. They have to lend money. They have to do the transmission thing. They have to help the recovery. And I don't think they're doing a brilliant job yet.
Right, just before I go to the last interventions from the Foreign Minister and the Commissioner, several people, this always happens towards the end, a lot of you who've now woken up and you're now sending me lots of messages, but we can't go on, unfortunately. I'll try and let them move on into the next session. But there are a couple of points here about Europe being too introverted, mentioning here Korea acting globally. Where is Europe with innovative ideas to enhance export and its economic growth? We talk about Europe and reshaped global Europe. Is the time of the economic and financial crises the right time to reform and strengthen the European Union? You can see the thrust there of several points being made. Firstly, Minister, and then finally the Commissioner.
Thank you. I agree. Europe is being introverted. Europe is dealing with its own problems, but at the same time we are avoiding the place which we are supposed to be. So what's important is, again, the issue of confidence. The last summit we had in June was a good sign, step in good direction, send a positive signals. Now, tomorrow, we are expecting a big report from President Van Rompuy, which I really believe, and we are all set to work very hard in coming weeks, and I do believe that it will help to regain the confidence. That's very important, and that it will free some of our capacities to deal with the issues which go beyond Europe. And this is what is expected from us. I'm a Euro optimist. I do believe that by the end of this year, we'll be in a better place than where we are now.
I have to remind you the next session is the crises and beyond, so we're not ditching all these issues. We're merely acting as the springboard for the next session. Finally, Commissioner.
Simply when you have a lot of things to deal with, there is no other way that you first deal with those things. But I think that we try to do our best that we stay also in the international agenda. In Rio, I'm pretty convinced that we were a very serious player there, and we were also seen as that in that one major conference, I think, for the future of the humanity. I would just give a short answer also to our Indian colleague. In Copenhagen was truly a failure, but there a lot happened in Durban, and I sincerely hope that in 2015, like was agreed, all countries from the world will finally come on board. And illegal trade, we have last year adopted legislation on the EU level that, for example, illegal harvested timber in any country in the world will not be anymore able to be sold in the European market. And as you know, timber is one of very important issues, especially when it comes to environment. But welcome to Slovenia. I hope you will enjoy.
I've got to stop now because it's time for coffee, tea, or whatever you want to drink, orange juice, and I apologise to those who didn't get to intervene. But do come back. Stephen Castle will be here, building forward on the crises, and then Edward Mortimer later, particularly on Europe's relations with the Arab revolutions. Thank you all very much indeed. Can I thank Natasha Brisky as well for helping me?